Around the year 155, in the stadium at Smyrna, a Roman governor offered an old bishop named Polycarp his life for one sentence. Romans called Christians atheists, deniers of the gods, and the way out was a formula: swear by Caesar's guardian spirit and say, "Away with the atheists." Polycarp looked around at the crowd that had come to watch him die, waved his hand at them and said, "Away with the atheists." Polycarp outlived them all, the last man history can name who had sat and listened to an apostle of Jesus, and with him the age of living memory ends. Smyrna wrote down what happened in that stadium in a letter you can still read. He was the bishop, the pastor with oversight of the church, in Smyrna, a port city in what's now Turkey, and behind his authority stood a claim that reached back a lifetime. In his youth he had learned the faith from John, the disciple of the Lord, the man Irenaeus says leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper, and later published his gospel at Ephesus, down the coast. Irenaeus knew, because he had listened to Polycarp the same way, late in life he could still point to the very spot where Polycarp sat when he taught about his conversations with John and with the others who had seen the Lord. Teaching he kept, he said, not on paper, but in my heart. Some modern scholars wonder whether Polycarp's John was a second John, an elder of the same name. Irenaeus, who had it from Polycarp himself, says apostles taught him, and apostles made him bishop. Around the year 110, a prisoner passed through under guard, Ignatius, bishop of Antioch, on his way to Rome, and the beasts. The two bishops met, and of the 7 letters Ignatius wrote on that journey, one went to Polycarp personally, already bishop nearly half a century before his own arena, and it gave him one line in particular: "Stand firm, like an anvil being struck." One letter of Polycarp's own survives, written to the church at Philippi, the congregation Paul had planted. It's stitched together from the apostles' writings. No one like him, he admits, can keep pace with the wisdom of the blessed and glorious Paul. And one warning echoes John's letters almost word for word. Everyone who does not confess that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is Antichrist. Old age didn't blunt him. Marcion, a celebrity teacher who had thrown the Old Testament and its God out of Christianity, asked him, "Do you know me?" "I do know you," said Polycarp, the firstborn of Satan. Yet the same man traveled to Rome, and when he and Rome's bishop Anicetus fell out over the date of Easter, neither settled it. He had kept his day. He told Anicetus, with John the disciple of the Lord and the rest of the apostles, neither gave way, neither broke fellowship. Anicetus had his guest lead communion, the bread and cup of the Lord's table, and they parted in peace. Then the persecution came. Modern reconstructions from the officials and calendar markers named in the letter place it in 155 or 156. Eusebius dated it to 166 or 167. No imperial decree, a festival crowd and a handful of Christians condemned to the beasts. A young man named Germanicus dragged the animal onto himself. The crowd answered with a chant, "Away with the atheists," and a demand that someone find Polycarp. His people talked him into withdrawing to a farm outside town, where he prayed night and day for the churches. 3 days before they came for him, he saw a vision of his pillow catching fire and said what it meant: "I must be burned alive." The search party tortured a slave boy of his household until he gave up the address. The letter tells the arrest with the Gospels underneath. Betrayed by his own, it says, like the Lord. An armed posse came at supper time, as if for a robber. Polycarp said, "The will of God be done," came downstairs and ordered them a meal. He asked one favor, an hour to pray, then prayed aloud for 2. Some of the men began to regret coming. On the ride into the city, the police chief, his name, the letter notes, was Herod, worked on him the whole way. What harm in saying Caesar is Lord and offering the incense? Polycarp said he would not. Thrown from the carriage hard enough to scrape his shin, he walked on to the stadium as if nothing had happened. As he entered, the letter reports, a voice came from heaven. No one saw a speaker, but the Christians present heard it. "Be strong, Polycarp, and play the man." Inside, the governor tried to talk him out of dying. "Respect your years, swear, curse Christ, and I release you." He answered, 86 years I have served him, and he has done me no wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? 86 years was his service, not his age. The letter never gives that, so he was that old at least. When the governor kept pushing, Polycarp ended it. Here plainly, I am a Christian. And offered, if the governor really wanted to know what Christianity taught, to name a day and explain it. Threatened with beasts, he said, call for them. Threatened with fire. Yours burns for a while and goes out. He answered, there is an eternal fire coming at the judgment kept for the ungodly. But why are you waiting? Bring what you want. A herald proclaimed it 3 times. Polycarp has confessed himself a Christian. The crowd roared that this was the teacher of Asia, the father of the Christians, the destroyer of our gods, and screamed for a lion. The game's official refused. The animal shows were closed. So the cry became fire, and the crowd hauled wood out of workshops and bathhouses, while the old man's vision came true. They moved to nail him to the post, and he stopped them. Leave me as I am. The one who gives me strength to endure the fire will let me stand in it unmoved, without the security of your nails. So they only tied him. His last prayer wasn't a plea, it was thanksgiving for being counted worthy of that day and that hour, of a share in the cup of Christ. Then they lit it. The fire, the eyewitnesses said, bellied out around him like a ship's sail in the wind. And he stood inside it not like flesh burning, but like bread baking, like gold and silver refined in a furnace, and a smell like frankincense drifted over the stadium. When the fire wouldn't finish him, an executioner went in with a dagger, and the blood came out in such quantity it put the fire out. All surviving manuscripts include a dove rising from the wound, while Eusebius's 4th century excerpt omits it. Scholars remain divided over whether the detail is original. The body was burned rather than handed over. Herod's father asked the governor not to give it up, warning that the Christians might abandon the crucified one and begin to worship this man. The letter answers him. Christ they worship as the Son of God. The martyrs they love as his disciples. They gathered the bones, more valuable than precious stones, and finer than refined gold, and resolved to meet every year on the day the letter calls the birthday of his martyrdom. It all survives because a church further inland asked what had happened, and Smyrna answered with a letter meant to be passed on, an eyewitness report that names names, down to the officials on duty in the hour of the day. The martyrdom of Polycarp is the oldest detailed account of a Christian martyr's death that survives outside the New Testament. Revelation opens with 7 letters from the risen Jesus to 7 churches in Asia. The second went to Smyrna, this church. It warns, do not fear what you are about to suffer, and it holds out a promise. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. When Smyrna's Christians wrote up their bishop's death, they knew which promise had been kept. He had been crowned, they said, with the crown of immortality. Polycarp had 86 years of evidence and a teacher who had seen the risen Jesus. The king had saved him and had done him no wrong. And lying about that was the one thing he would not do. What held him in the fire wasn't stubbornness, it was gratitude. Smyrna wrote its letter, and decades later, Irenaeus wrote down what he had carried in his heart. Ignatius had told Polycarp to stand like an anvil being struck, and that is how the church remembered him.